some statistics and improvements, which means that they're likely to invest in healthcare, likely to invest in education, and similar things insofar as these are ways in which they can demonstrate structural development, which will then allow them to retain a lease rather than having to explain why they haven't done these things. Insofar as these competition exists, it's a structural mechanism of internal control that doesn't exist in the side of government. Note, Jack doesn't answer Lover's POI. But secondly, there's a mechanism of external control, right? Insofar as political consumerism is on the rise, companies like Abercrombie and Fitch have been almost bankrupted when people found out that they have sweatshops in Bangladesh. Note that the a priori skepticism towards the corporate sector and the belief that they're just callous capitalists is going to have a very strong influence here. They're literally taking over a city in a developing world country. This looks like capital colonialism, which means there's a huge amount of skepticism and scrutiny on these companies, which means there's an incredible amount of investigative journalism going on about these things, which means that these are things that are reported and are heard about, which means that insofar as there are threats of these companies being boycotted and therefore their assets losing value, there are external control mechanisms as to why they're going to be accountable. Thirdly, insofar as the regulations in these countries are very often incredibly lax already, if they exist, are unimplemented. And thirdly, the minimum wage is probably quite low. That's why people move like they're manufacturing there. I'm unsure what the delta is and what the regulation that all fees is going to be removed is anyway. That's not the way they make profit. What is the way they're going to make profit here? It's creating a comparative advantage from scratch. It's doing something like making the city a tax haven. Imagine Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the US Virgin Islands. It's things like legalizing gambling or marijuana, catering to a specific type of tourism that's not found anywhere else in the region. In Indonesia, for example, where alcohol is banned, you can have a particular city where alcohol is legal. This is a comparative advantage insofar as you provide things that are found nowhere else in the region, but you also create an entire new industry from scratch, which means it's a source of tax revenue that physically wasn't available in any other way before. The reason why it's incredibly important is because it's more efficient than any other type of comparative advantage, right? Because most comparative advantages these countries have are in natural resources, which very often end up being mismanaged, which very often end up being sold at hugely low prices insofar as they have to do this. It's their only source of income. And because of mismanagement, they end up being victim to things like the Dutch disease, currency appreciation and stuff like this. But also secondly, the fact that these are new industries in and of itself creates jobs and access to jobs for people that would not have got them otherwise and would have never been supplied by the state government, insofar as the repurposement of industry provides this in an a priori way which doesn't exist otherwise. This is how they make profit. This is how they provide access. This is how we generate revenue. But also secondly, know that on a day-to-day level, life in these cities is simply easier in terms of access to goods and services. One, know that these companies have expertise in negotiation and a vested interest to make their projects profitable, which means that when they negotiate with construction companies for urban planning, when they negotiate public transportation schemes in terms of importing certain materials and so on and so forth, they have the ability and incentive to get better prices and better deals a priori for the funding of these infrastructural projects, which therefore means that they do not end up with unprofitable projects which run a deficit and a debt. The reason why prices are hiked for things like public transport is because you do not have profitable and accessible public transport. The consequence of this being that you have to make up for the loss in the deficit by hiking up prices. However, if you get a better deal a priori when constructing these systems, and secondly, if you make it accessible in terms of a lower baseline price to everyone, it means you have a steady trickle of consumers using these systems, which means you're able to run a profit rather than a deficit, which is a structural incentive for these things to be accessible. But secondly, note in terms of a lot of services like telecommunications services, for example, or electricity provision or water provision. These are very often national monopolies in these countries, which means that there is no natural market competition and they're protected by national bureaucracies, which means that there is absolutely no barrier for governments and not to use this as a way to generate extortionate revenue from individuals insofar as these are only access to telecommunication, only access to internet. In these cities, there's likely to be competition in terms of who provides these services rather than a monopoly. And therefore, insofar as you want to get customers, you are more likely to provide accessible deals and accessible prices as opposed to the government, which is hugely politically unaccountable for reasons accepted by both opening government and opening opposition, and therefore doesn't have an incentive to increase that accessibility. But lastly, we say just easier to set up business on a day-to-day level because regulation is likely to be less strict. You have more access to setting up a business, but also more different industries that don't exist anywhere else, as I've said earlier, which means that one, you grant more agency to individuals insofar as they have more access to quality of life. The comparative is not rural people moving here probably for the reasons Kevin describes. The comparative is a person moving from Abuja or Lagos to this kind of city. At this point, the 5 or 6 comparative reasons I gave you as to why life is easier there is one, an inherent benefit in terms of benefiting the average citizen, which is far more important than the abstract stuff we get from opening government. But secondly, it also means that in general, you're able to generate more revenue and more economic diversification. Before I move on, I will take opening opposition.
When there is depressed growth and these private cities lock in regulations and wage rates at a certain length to maintain long-term competitive like investment or competition, you will lock these people into poverty for a long-term period of time, not just a short period.
That works only if you haven't listened to a bunch of mechanisms I gave in my case as to why that's not true. You probably should have listened. But lastly, opening opposition cares about rural areas. Note that very often the reason why rural areas are underfunded is because states have to spend a lot of capital in terms of sunk cost of financing rising megacities, servicing the overpopulation in these cities, being aware these are the only business centers that they have, so they comparatively pump a majority of capital into these places. Insofar as you now get new private cities which become business centers, or there is a privatization of older cities, regardless which characterization you buy, this allows states to outsource those costs to private entities who now bear the full brunt of the risk, which is also an incentive for efficiency, by the way, which means that there's more leftover capital for states to invest in rural areas and provide basic infrastructure, insofar as their political focus is not focused exclusively on maintaining mega cities, which are going to fail unless the state services their running costs. Lastly, we just want to say that the federal government is far more able to regulate these cities than if you have, an opposition mayor who is going to say, this federal overreach into my city. Comparison is when you have a company, there's far more incentive for you to regulate these cities as a government. For all of these reasons, closing government wins.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the member of opposition to start the CO case. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
All right, cool. Just a few seconds with my timer. Cool. Just making sure I'm audible. Lovely. I will start in 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm quite confused by what this debate actually is about, because I think most of the teams have been arguing quite washable things in reality as to how development actually works and what will happen on the ground. The first thing I'll do is to be more granular and walk through multiple likely scenarios of how this privatization takes place and the harms that exist in each of them. The second thing I'll do is explain why in the long run, even if in the short term things are awash, the existence of governmental structures and norms of accountability are key to the long-term development of the country and the stabilization of the nation as a whole. The first thing I want to talk about is most of the benefits that GovStat has are washable. The reason for that is that's literally a case for FDI and why you want to invest in places in general to create economic development, and not specifically the tipping point of this motion, which is why do you want companies instead of government to run the city rather than simply invest in the city, right? The only analysis that OG gives is, there's a risk of cronyism and there's a risk which dissuades investment. But look, when OG's like overly careful setup puts in place like negotiations with governments, the threat of expropriation, all these things involve the same degree of risk and cronyism that exists because you interact with the government anyway, which means the same degrees of risk calculuses also affect the same investment decisions. I'm unclear what's the tipping point to massively create investment on your side but not on ours. What I think is the likely scenario is a fewfold. The first is there are going to be some situations whereby these investments will be short-term and extremely horrendous. There's no analysis beyond mere assertion coming from both our opening and all the other houses. This is not a knife, by the way. It's likelihood analysis as to why this is not the case. The first thing, per Abhinav, these places have no use. Governments will sell for cheap, meaning that A, it's quite expensive to do long-term development there, right? Ours asserts it's cheap, but gives no analysis to why it actually will be cheap to start from the ground up. Literally, these places are unused for a reason, right? There's no connection to the hinterland. There's probably no infrastructure structure already in place. There's no sizable population you can tap upon, which means your ability to make long-term profit is largely curtailed, and the ability for you to sustainably do these places long-term is largely curtailed. But also for Avianap, if you buy these places for cheap, you have no incentive to keep them long-term because you can easily flip them as with cheap stocks in order to make a great profit in the short term and therefore ruin the place, and that's extremely harmful. CG also help us build this, by the way, when they say, aha, we use a leasing system. Notice the prisoner dilemma exists. Whenever you lease, there's always an off shot that in the next renewal, you lose it off to a competitor, which means the likely scenario when you have to lease is to maximize each and every amount of profit you have and then screw off because there's an uncertain return, even if you do your best, because other people might compete and steal the lease from you, which means there is an incentive and a likelihood that these places would be used up for extremely messed up purposes in the short term, and that is horrendous. The only response that we get from both closing and opening to mitigate this is arts and assets, shareholder accountability repeated by CG. One, this is just BS because literally look at the types of companies that invest here. I just hate the lack of granularity in these arguments, right? Like petrol companies or property developers do horrible things every day. The fact is, if you were conscious environmentally, you wouldn't buy the shares of these things in the first place. So there's no shareholder accountability because you probably won't care. CG's analysis is even worse. Abercrombie and Fitch can be regulated because it's a consumer setting thing where people can vote by their feet. You can't vote with your feet with petroleum companies because you have to turn on your friggin' light every day anyway, which means when you have little to no choice, I'm unclear how any shareholder regulation works. Just look at the horrendous things BP and Shell have done in developing countries and nobody gave a fuck. Not to mention stuff like news cycles of reporting these things being unimportant. I am unclear why this works. That's extremely horrendous when you exploit these spaces in the short term. First of all, you massively displace people who are already there by giving you control of the land. You make them lose their livelihoods, their homes. You uproot entire families and communities that are already in these places. Perhaps sometimes often through extremely obtrusive measures as well. When you look at how land reclamation happens in developing areas, you literally send thugs and gangs to beat people up, to get them away, and to start new places. That's extremely bad and massive harms. But also everything else tried to preempt stuff like massive resource extraction and pollution and unsustainable level. The inability for the state to use the taxation funds that you get from this when foreign companies are the actors that do the extraction, brought and the selling of, for instance, public assets or lands for cheap prices to maximize profits, means that ultimately you waste the potential that exists in these places and you fuck over irreversibly the environment that literally harms the lungs or the health of everyone around. For instance, look at how Sao Paulo and burning the Amazon literally not only stop the economy of other places, but also help down the health of people in these places as well, which means that's a massive harm. But secondly, even if you invest long-term, which is possible in some scenario, why is that equally horrendous? Notice the utopia that government describes. A beautiful city where you invest massively talented people and whereby this is extremely amazing and sparkly clean. What is the consequence? There's a reason why development happens in stages and you learn to walk before you run. The reason is you can't price things like goods, services, and other things to a symmetric point where you're both able to cater to extremely well-educated and high-paying people and also poor individuals. To the extent that you create a city that attracts and generates investment to a very large extent, massive gentrification occurs. The reason for this is simple. You want to profit maximize in the place, and you also have already invested massive sunk costs in buying the land. The way shareholder reports and quarterly reports work means that you need to fill in that massive investment by quick returns on price. And the way you do that is by massively overcharging on things like leasing properties for services, for food, for other things. And the overcharge spills on in a mechanical spillover effect. When you have to pay a lot for a lease, you have to charge more because you need to recuperate the lease, and that continues to spill over to other prices. This is a much better mechanization than almost bare assertion that things will be expensive and people can't pay. What this means is that only the people that OG wants to import into these places, so the rich expats, can pay for everything there. Everyone else literally is fucked because they're unable to access any of these services and goods. What happens to these people? The outcome is if they can't buy property, they can't buy goods, but the premise of government is they would actually have good investment, there would be economic activity here. These people have to live in slums and other places that are geographically close, but not in the city, so the company has no jurisdiction. That's horrendous, right? Literally just think of how the overcrowding would occur, the massive hygienic outbreaks, like the cholera outbreaks that happens in slums quite often, that literally kills people, the horrendous amount of degradation that happens in these places that literally fucks over the lives of the most poor individuals. I think that's an extremely horrendous place for these people to be in. Why is the comparative actually bad? And I think I also don't want to deal with tin stuff, because tin says, you can price things lower because you need to maximize sales volume to ensure profitability. The problem is, one, this is not short-termism and it goes against the short-term incentives of companies. But two, there's a cap for sales volume because there's only so much these people can pay. If you put it so low, and even if everyone pays, you still can't recap your sunk costs, which means you have to price it higher, but fewer people pay, pay, but I'll have more money to maximize profit. The last thing I want to talk about is long-term stuff, right? Because I think on the comparative, at the very least, when you have a government, there's some semblance of democracy. And structurally, even if in the short term it's a wash, in the long run, there are 5 structural reasons why democracy is improving. Just first of all, empirically, it's true that these places are gradually democratizing for reasons such as education, just improve social media access to foreign norms. There's a rising middle class that has consumption power and is looking for more aspirational rights and starting to demand changes, and also exposure through FDN to Western media, Western understanding, and also foreignly educated individuals coming back to these places and spreading democratic norms with them, which ultimately means even if in the short term things are awash, we're able to get things like clearing of slums, better living conditions, and better policies in the long term when you retain governance in these cities. You get none of that on government. You create extremely horrendous situations. Can be proud to stand in closing opposition.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the Gov group to conclude the Gov case for this debate. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, 1 second. So I want to make one big point of clarification towards closing opposition and opening opposition as well. There are penalties if you pull out early in this case from the lease. It's likely no one will take you again for the city. You are likely going to have to pay a huge amount of money, or you're going to end up sued in court, which is then going to cause you to pay a lot more money if you don't do this. But generally, long-term leasing is very stable, and I can back that up with evidence, but we shouldn't do that in debate. So I will back this with analysis, unlike the assertion that comes from closing opposition that all folks are inherently big gamblers. And I think if you look at the stock market, if you look at institutional investors that we are talking about here, who are the only ones who have the capital to actually do this. This is not your random Reddit guys crew who are going to, topple down the market, or your gamblers that are maybe talking about like a couple $100 million. These are people who have billions and billions of dollars of capital. These are usually investments from pension funds, from mutual funds. So very small amount of people or institutional investors that are going to do these things. This is the comparative that like Uber and Tesla and people who are long-term investments are one of the most valued companies today. These people have markups on their investments ranging from 5 to 6%, and that is enough because this gives enough of a compound interest effect so that you have 100% or 200% more of a retirement fund than what you had in the beginning. These people are not your average Wall Street bad guy and corporations that want to just go into in 1 year and make a profit for 50 years, because that's not how institutional investment in building and property works. Guys, we have this in status quo. This is like when they develop malls. This is when they develop big buildings that rent out space. The institutional investors exist. We are allowing them to tap into the market of investing in cities as well, except for investing in parts of the cities that they are doing right now. So it's a disingenuous clarification or contextualization from closing opposition. Let's engage with opening opposition. Why are rural areas better off, even if they have all of the harms that they list in their case? First, there is more money from taxation if you cut costs on our side of the house. Secondly, there is less need for federal government to subsidize things if they are run more efficiently, and if you have money to actually run them on your own without the need for federal government to subsidize you. But three, the economic development per se creates demand from rural areas for both workers, but also for products and services. If we're talking about like only the basic things such as food and things that the rural area usually provides to these big cities, this is a huge boost to their demand as well, and to their ability to also make a living, even if they don't have to, even if they don't move to the city, which is also a good thing in some cases. Like this is what most people have been doing for the past 20, 30, 50 years in the developing world, where there's been huge increase in the urbanization percentage. So I'm not sure why you are saying that this is inherently a bad comparative on their side of the house as well. But also, fourthly, look, connecting these cities becomes more profitable if they are run better and if they have better economies. Meaning if you have spin-off effects of building roads and railways between these cities, they'll also connect to rural areas so they have better connectivity. But fifthly, and this is the bottom line, these people already depend on the kindness of the local sheriffs and status quo who provide them services in the big cities. Because in rural areas, you don't have universities, you don't have hospitals, you cannot access government like institution where you can get a new ID or whatever you need. So if these things are run efficiently and better under our side of the house, then these rural people are far off better for the access that they get to services and the quicker access to these services compared to the idea of, oh, now people in the city are better off, because they are already better off, and they are pissed because people in the city have access to things they don't necessarily have access to things, and this is what actually is something which is bad for them. Let's compare ourselves in contribution and also in opening government directly. The connection between growth from opening government and opening opposition. This is the question first. OG says you will so opening opposition says you will cut rights of workers and regulation there. I already explained why this is short-termist and unlikely to happen, which OG didn't from the perspective of companies, but this is unreliable. Companies are in for the long term. They can lose money on this, guys. Like, there can be another city which undercuts you, and then if this is your whole strategy of making profit in 20 or 30 years, like what happened to China in some of these instances where they were undercut by Vietnam and other countries, this is something which you cannot depend on long term, meaning that companies do not have an incentive to do this. This is important. They don't have the incentive to do this. Not to say they won't do this. They don't have the incentive to do this, unlike what was said from opening government. But also, why they do not necessarily from opening government would you have the incentive to cut red tape or improve business conditions in other ways. What do we tell you? What do we extend in this? Which is the only comparative. Why they won't cut working rights, but they have to do something else in order to make a business. First, they have better relations with federal government because they're not political enemies. Meaning, this is the reasoning why you would have more easier permit process or more effective courts, protection against illiquidity or not paying and blah, blah, blah. Because they are not enemies to the federal government usually and still is going to provide these things. But second, their regulation that can be liberalized in general without doing anything that is mentioned on OG and OO. And these are the things such as financial regulation or access to SINs in otherwise very rigid markets because the economy is not that developed. So you need to have a very rigid financial market overall, but some cities could have a very liberal capital market, like what happened with China and Macau and Hong Kong and blah, blah, blah. But also long-term investment is something which is comparative in this debate, and we prove this. This impacts education, impacts healthcare, and this doesn't happen on their side of the house when the time span is 4 years till election, but when the time span is 30 years. So if I invest in a school now and in 20 years, I'm going to have a much better educated work population that can then have higher wages, pay higher taxes, gain more productivity in the city. This is the thing that transcends the opening clash, whether they're going to cut working rights or whether they're not going to cut working rights, because there's a more sustainable way of going for this on our side of the house that we offer. But also, recognize that OG says state is bad and unlocking resources, but they never tell you where exactly is the space for concrete change or savings with the governments. And we explain this as well. We explain how overpriced utilities can be made efficient, how investments are not profitable can and will be checked for feasibility by corporations, unlikely to be checked for feasibility by these cities. And now I want to take OO.
So if the government doesn't provide services on either side because of OG's mechanisms about them not being able to tax or anything, what is the comparative? The comparative is where corporations and how they provide these services. If their incentives are to change when this highly profitable private city takes them out of these regions, you just create a situation where they all compete against each other. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the incentives of what I just told you, why they're long-term, why they look at 20, 30 years, and why the government doesn't, because they're not going to win elections. He's not going to be alive. Like the mayor is not going to be alive when these like investments take place. This is the comparative. This is the mechanism. Okay, so moving on to explaining this one last thing. So the calculus is more long-term, and thus you can unlock more investment as opposed to politician who is elected every 4 years. And lastly, I think we show that competition is inherent in proving why things are not symmetric. This is something that OG doesn't have. We give you the contextualization of who is able to do these things, why it is profitable for them, and why you're going to have more people, more companies competing for the lease. This is the biggest accountability mechanism, and why there are going to be other people ready to replace your lease if you do bad things. This is very important in proving that the incentives of these companies are actually going to be bad. So for these reasons, we are the ones who prove why the comparative of insurances actually happens, because you have a market for this, and this is important in proving accountability in this debate. That's it.
All right, thank you very much. To close the debate, I'll invite the opposition with here.
Cool. Give me one quick sec. I'm sorting my headphones or audio setting. Cool. Am I audible now?
Yep.
Cool. Cheers. In 3, 2, 1. the woeful lack of response coming from closing governments in terms of institutional building, in terms of how private companies cannot a priori be assumed to carry out the most efficient sort of agendas and also service provision have costed them this debate. 3 parts of my speech. The first is to deal with OG's purely robust but generic case of like why FDI is good. And if I manage to show you that we capture the benefits, I think it's a wash on this side of the house. So let's start with that. The central claim to American opening government is this. They said state is poor in unlocking skills because of, resources, tax evasion, informal economy, those sort of reasons. And somehow having an intermediate follows an increase in investments and trickles out of the whole country. The first general observation I'd like to make are issues which happen in any sort of human society in whatever. And we prove that the perverse incentive is also symmetrical and even worse on this side of the house. Look, the second response to that is we doubt the competence of governments is as bad as they claim, because underlying in their analysis, they said, government is backed by some form of coercive threats, and people are scared of governments, hence they might be able to expropriate lands. If that competency is true, I'm unsure what current nation state are so incompetent in terms of policing, enforcing the regulations against tax evasions and all forms of economic policies that requires a collection and allocation of resources. But look, thirdly, and more importantly, I'm truly baffled to why normal rich FDI companies would not just invest invest with FDIs as in our comparative world. Because look, it is totally unclear why this is the tipping point in which how FDI investments actually occur. Given as per their own characterization, they are rich enough currently to leverage or even bribe local governments to enter into the country. So the profit margins might not be humongous, but is it sustainable to the current extent where those companies are able to accompany, minimal state regulations, and that is already sufficient in the status quo? And the pushback coming from them is, if you invest in a big country, it's a big portfolio of investment, and that results in diversification. I think this is what CG tries to extend upon, and I'll deal with that shortly in conjunction with responses to closing government. But the fourth response I gave to opening government is this, right? I think they're mechanistically dubious in 4 fronts. The first is to say they never really have done the sort of starting point or baseline of analysis, because look, a lot of these, to take over a country often would have to start with taking over a deficit, right? Because there's a huge amount of international debts occur. There's massive upskilling and specialization required to actually kickstart the economy. So you can cross-reference Josh's each of those analysis. But 2 more additional responses to that. The first is to say the distributional challenges they talk about in terms of there's a range of class or ethnic tensions in those specific regions. There's no guarantees that new corporations or new owners can sort of alleviate the tensions in the same way. That's I think you just can't assume attracting a huge swathe of McKinsey and analysts would be able to implement those sort of policies and alleviate tensions on the ground. But the second thing to say is tax evasion. If profit incentives were that high, if not even higher in the world, I just don't see why the same sort of FDI companies would not want to evade tax. The hypothetical best pushback that could come from them is to say, we have more money, but the issue sticks, and here's how our extension comes in perfectly. Because we set a norm that cronism is permissible in the long run. That means even if in the future it is sustainable, you lock these citizens, and especially vulnerable citizens, out of accessing any form of agency to oppose any kind of economic policies in the long run. I'm just not sure why a new actor taking over is something justifiable at the long run. And finally, what opening government conveniently cites up as this, right? There is necessarily a trade-off in the way of how takeover is being carried out. You have to crush out small businesses, you have to sell off public assets. And I just don't think Albanov's analysis saying, things are so bad and therefore states consented to sell off means that there's no more benefit to treat them as nation states anymore. I think this is just a patronizing way of seeing how state services are being implemented there right now. What is the way against Dobbs' case? The first is to say, I think, on a short term, on the first count, a short-term assessment, I think they said, more likely to, these private companies are more likely to invest because, it is a short-term assessment that they carry out. But I think, as they said, if land is cheap, the risk of investment will mean flocks of small FDI companies just come in. So even if 50 of the people just hedge the bets and invest in short term, it is horrendous because of all those harms that are attached with creating slums or having inefficient economic policies that attach catches with it. I think, in the long term, the reputational damage done to these countries where you set a precedent of like economic failure, the risk of that in itself means that these companies, these future states will be absolutely screwed because the states will have to take up the huge burden of reviving these cities in the long run. So on that basis, let's deal with a closing government's case. I think closing government did a few things, right? The first thing they said is, you could create new industries, and when you sort of kick off new industries such as like legalizing gambling and alcohol, you're better able to deal with but you're better able to sort of shore up sort of profits and do not have to hike up sort of profits. Two responses to that. The first primary response is this, right? I think the vast amount of examples they've given are actually state-created policies. In Hong Kong and Macau, in terms of alcohol, deregulation policies came from states. That means there are other avenues for current states to explore to maintain economic profits and deliver sort of outcomes without having to concede the full autonomy on that front. But secondly, I think when they say, there's better finance and sort of competition, I think the first response to that, is that they're collapsing two analyses into one, because they just either can't assume big monopolies would not lock out other companies to sustain their own monopolies, or two oligopolies who could sustainably collude in prices of consumer goods or land sharing agreements, which means that their own examples literally shot themselves in the foot, because notice those like corporations has a huge sort of control over those regions. But secondly, I think their accountability mechanism that they claim is massively diminished because of three reasons. And housing extension directly clashes with that. The first is to say there's irreversible environmental harms, because most likely these corporations can only plausibly, a high source of income is to extract a lot of resources, energy supplies. But secondly, right, when the prices hikes up, they hike up certain prices, certain form of goods, it's unlikely why, the benefit trickles down to a net level, because you cannot recap the sunk cost, which means the cost is passed on to the consumers who has to pick out the service. And this means it concerns like essential services like energy supply, which these citizens have absolutely zero agency to control over with. I think and finally, that it's mere assertion to say, you can invest in services that private actors have an incentive to make things efficient in rural areas. I think even engaging with the best case scenario, and here's how we win the debate, by positing that institutional building norms is something that we would not trade off at the expense of these sort of services where we can actually sustain. We'd be able to open opposition by providing you the key institutional that is pervasive in any sort of services, and in securing those benefits and not just preventing harm. So providing a positive case as opposed to just negating and mitigating government harms. Immensely proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much, Opwip and everyone, for the debate. It's a silent round, so this is being live streamed, or y'all can just leave. And me and Avi